Imagine arriving in New York City with only 4 cents in your pocket, a few poems, and a mind full of impossible dreams. Nikola Tesla stood before Thomas Edison, the most powerful man in science. One was a billionaire wizard. The other was a penniless immigrant. A great promise was made. A massive lie was told. And the greatest war in the history of science was about to begin. Welcome back. This is episode 2, The City of Dreams and Lightning. Relax, listen to natural English, and let the story of the War of the Currents begin. Part 1, The Golden Door of New York.
The year was 1884. The ship was old and the sea was angry. I stood on the deck, shivering in the cold wind. I had almost nothing left in the world. My luggage had been stolen at the train station. My tickets and my money were gone. In my pocket, I had only 4 cents. I had a few poems I had written myself. I had some technical calculations, and I had a very important letter. It was addressed to the most famous man in America, Thomas Alva Edison. As the ship entered the harbor, I saw the Statue of Liberty. She was still being built, surrounded by metal. To me, she was not just a statue. She was a symbol of the future. I felt like a soldier entering a battlefield. New York City was a shock to my soul. It was loud, dirty, and chaotic. Horse-drawn carriages splashed through mud. Thousands of people shouted in many languages. It was a city that never seemed to sleep. It was a city built on raw ambition. I walked through the crowded streets, feeling like a ghost from another world. I was tall, thin, and very hungry. But I did not feel poor. I carried a secret power inside my head. I carried the blueprints for a new world. Part 2, Meeting the Wizard of Menlo Park. I finally reached the office of Thomas Edison. People called him the Wizard. He was the man who gave light to the night. He was a hero to every inventor on Earth. When I finally stood before him, my heart was pounding like a hammer. Edison was a rough, practical man. His clothes were stained with oil and chemicals. He looked at me, a young European immigrant, with sharp, suspicious eyes. I handed him the letter from my former boss. Edison opened it and read it slowly. The letter said, "I know 2 great men. One is you, Mr. Edison. The other is this young man standing before you." Edison looked up from the paper. He grunted and threw it on his desk. "So you think you are a genius?" he asked. His voice was raspy and tired. I told him about my ideas for AC, alternating current. I told him it could send electricity across hundreds of miles. Edison shook his head and laughed. "Forget that nonsense," he snapped. "AC is dangerous. It is like a wild snake. My direct current, DC, is safe and steady. It is the only way to light the world. He didn't want to hear my theories, but he needed a good engineer. His power stations were breaking down. His ships were stuck in the harbor. He looked at my thin frame and said, "Start working tonight. We have work to do." Part 3. The $50,000 Promise. I worked for Edison for many months. I worked 20 hours every single day. I slept only a few hours on a workbench. I fixed his machines when no one else could. I admired his energy, but we were different. He was a businessman. I was a dreamer. One day, Edison complained about his dynamos. They were inefficient and constantly failing. He looked at me and made a joke. "Tesla," he said, "if you can improve these, I will give you $50,000. $50,000! In 1885, that was a mountain of gold. It was enough to build my own laboratory. It was enough to change my life forever. I didn't say a word. I simply went to work. For nearly a year, I lived in the machines. I redesigned the internal wires. I balanced the spinning parts. I barely ate, and I rarely spoke. I used my gift of visualization to see the flow of the current. Finally, the day came. The dynamos were perfect. They hummed with a beautiful, steady song. They were more powerful than ever before. I went to Edison's office with a smile. I was proud of my achievement. "Mr. Edison," I said politely, "the work is finished. I believe I have earned the bonus. You promised me." Edison looked at me for a long moment. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "Tesla," he said, putting his feet on the desk, "you don't understand our American humor." My heart froze. "Humor?" I whispered. "Yes," he replied. "It was just a joke. I am not giving you $50,000. He offered me a small raise instead, only a few dollars extra per week. I felt a wave of cold anger. It was not about the money. It was about the honor. It was about the truth. I picked up my hat and walked to the door. "I quit," I said clearly. Edison didn't look up from his desk. He thought I was just an angry immigrant. He didn't realize he had just lost the greatest mind in the world. Part 4. Digging Ditches in the Dark. Suddenly, I was alone again. The winter of 1886 was the hardest of my life. No one would hire me as an engineer. The world of science had closed its doors. To survive, I had to work as a laborer. I spent my days digging ditches for $2. It was bitter work. My hands, which were meant for fine wires, were covered in blisters and dirt. I dug the very trenches where Edison's DC cables were buried. The irony was like a knife in my chest. I asked myself, is this why I survived the storm? Is this why I studied so hard? To dig holes in the cold mud of New York? But even in the dirt, the lightning in my mind did not die. I knew my AC motor would work. I could see it spinning in the darkness. I kept my drawings in my small room. I waited for a chance. I waited for someone to believe in the power of the future. Part 5. The Partnership of Power. A miracle happened in the mud. My foreman noticed that I wasn't an ordinary laborer. He saw me sketching complex motors on a piece of scrap paper. He introduced me to some investors. Finally, I had a small laboratory. I built my induction motor. It was silent. It was powerful. It didn't spark like Edison's machines. It used alternating current, the pulse of the universe. News of my invention reached a man named George Westinghouse. He was a brave man and a great engineer. He came to my lab and watched the motor. He didn't laugh and he didn't joke. He saw exactly what I saw. "This will change everything, Tesla," Westinghouse said. "This motor will power the world." He bought my patents for a large sum. Finally, I had the resources I needed. The battle lines were drawn. Part 6. The War of the Currents. The war began quietly at first. Westinghouse and I wanted to use AC. Edison wanted to protect his DC empire. It was a battle for the soul of the century. Whoever won would decide how the 20th century would look. Edison was terrified of losing. He began a campaign of fear. He told the newspapers that AC was a killer current. He said it would burn down houses and electrocute families in their sleep. To prove his point, he did terrible things. He held public demonstrations. He used AC to kill stray dogs and cats on the streets of New York. He even helped create the electric chair, using my system to execute criminals. He wanted the public to associate AC with death and execution. The newspapers were filled with horror. "The deadly current," they screamed. People were afraid to have electricity inside their homes. I watched these events with sadness. Science was being used for propaganda. But I knew the truth could not be hidden. I knew that light was meant to heal, not to hurt. I had to show the world the beauty of AC. Part 7. The Master of Light. In 1893, a great opportunity arrived. The World's Fair was coming to Chicago. It was called the White City. It was meant to be the greatest show in human history. They needed a way to light the entire fair. Edison and General Electric bid for the job. They asked for a huge amount of money. Westinghouse and I offered a lower price. We promised to light the fair using AC. Against all odds, we won the contract. Edison was furious. He refused to let us use his light bulbs. He tried to block our equipment. But I didn't care. I designed a new kind of bulb in weeks. I built the giant generators. The entire world was watching Chicago. On the opening night, thousands of people gathered in the dark. The President of the United States pushed a golden button. In a single heartbeat, the darkness was torn apart. 100,000 light bulbs flickered into life at once. The white city glowed like a jewel. The reflection in the lake was beautiful. People gasped and fell to their knees. They had never seen so much light. It was a forest of brilliance. The killer current had become the current of civilization. That night, the War of the Currents was effectively over. The future had arrived, and it was AC. Part 8. The Dream of Niagara returns. But my greatest victory was still to come. Do you remember my dream as a boy? The giant wheel under the falling water? The vision of Niagara Falls? Now, as a famous inventor, I finally returned to that dream. The world said it was impossible. They said the power of the falls could not be captured. But Westinghouse and I began to build. We built massive tunnels of stone. We built giant turbines of steel. I stood on the edge of the falls. The roar of the water was the same as I had heard in my mind years ago. The vibration in the earth matched the beat of my own heart. The invisible giant was waiting. In 1896, we flipped the switch. The power of the water turned into the power of light. The electricity traveled 20 miles, all the way to the city of Buffalo. It was a triumph of human spirit. I had kept my promise to my uncle. I had kept my promise to the universe. I had caught the lightning. But for me, this was only the beginning. I was looking further, much further than anyone else. I began to dream of a world without wires at all. I dreamed of sending energy through the very air we breathe. I dreamed of a planet where everyone had free, clean power. I built a new laboratory in a place called Wardenclyffe. I began to build a giant tower. It was a tower that reached for the sky. I wanted to talk to the stars. I wanted to heal the earth. But as I climbed higher, the shadows began to grow again. The bankers were worried. The businessmen were greedy. They didn't want free energy. They wanted a way to sell it. My mind was full of secrets. I was hearing strange signals from deep space. I was seeing the future of radio, of robots, and of weapons. The world began to think I was crazy. I was becoming a man out of time. A man who saw too much. A man who was lost in his own world of light. In the next episode, we will see the final act. The fall of the tower, the lonely room in the hotel, and the pigeons that became my only friends. The story of the man who invented the 20th century is coming to an end. Thank you for listening. The lightning is still in the air. See you in the next episode. The story continues. Good night.